lecture is the first of a series on national measures of welfare and prosperity. We'll begin with discussions about the gross domestic product, or GDP. During our discussions of the free market and market failures, we often discuss the idea of maximizing societal welfare. And we said that when all the conditions for the free market are fulfilled, the invisible hand magically maximizes social welfare. We also went on to define market failures as situations where societal welfare is not maximized. But what does this idea of maximizing or not maximizing social welfare actually mean? What do we mean when we talk about welfare and prosperity? As for general definitions, welfare is defined as, quote, the health, happiness, and fortunes of a person or group. Prosperity is defined as the state of being prosperous, which is actually defined as successful in material terms, flourishing financially, bringing wealth and success. Synonyms of prosperity are success, profitability, affluence, wealth, opulence, luxury, the good life, those sort of things, ease, comfort, security, and well-being. So you can see there are a variety of perspectives out there, and we all probably have our own views on what this idea really means, and varying slightly with different definitions for what we mean when we talk about personal welfare and prosperity. So depending on your personal goals, you might make different choices about how best to work towards what you're considering your goals of social welfare or your goals of personal welfare. But to do this in an informed way, you need to start with some sort of measure that tells you how you're doing and how close you're getting to those personal goals. Similar to us as individuals, societies also need meaningful measures for assessing the wealth and prosperity of that society. Only with a good understanding of where that society is at can the society as a whole make informed choices about where to go next. In this next series of lectures, we will look at 4 different measures of national welfare and prosperity. First, the gross domestic product. Second, the human development index. Third, the genuine progress indicator. And fourth, this idea of gross national happiness. Each of these measures represents a certain set of values and priorities, and each of these measures has its pros and its cons. What is important to realize is that these indicators are used by politicians and policymakers to make decisions about economic development and how to improve one's country. Now, the outcome of these decisions will depend very much on what parameters are included inside the measures. You can compare the situation to the effect of the grading criteria in an academic course. At the beginning of each term, students know how they'll be evaluated in the courses. Students then take this information and make decisions about how to best study for the course. If the assignments count more than the exam, students will obviously put more effort into the assignment. If it's the other way around, they might spend more time studying for the exam. Now, national measures of welfare and prosperity work exactly the same way, just at a higher level. The values these measures represent and the priorities that the measures drive will set how the development decisions are made by governments. What I want you to take away from this series of videos is a basic understanding of what's included, and even more importantly, what's omitted in different measures. And I need you to understand that these measures represent values. They guide development decisions, and often these measures are used to evaluate the performance of the governments. This first lecture, we're going to start with the gross domestic product, or GDP, which many of you have probably heard about because it is constantly talked about in the news. The GDP is a measure of the size of an economy, or in other words, the economic activity of an entire country. The GDP was developed by Simon Kuntz, a name that should be familiar to you that we talked about earlier, in about the 1930s after the First World War and the Great Depression. At that time, the main focus of governments was to grow the economy and create jobs so that everybody had work. Now, there are a number of different ways to calculate GDP, but in this course, we're going to use the so-called expenditure approach. In the expenditure approach, we have GDP, gross domestic product, is equal to consumption, investments, government spending, and net exports, which is the difference between exports and imports. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. Consumption refers to household expenditures on final goods and services, basically all the things we buy as individuals for our daily lives. Investments refers to purchases of individuals and businesses that relate to more long-term infrastructure and equipment. Buying a new house, for example, or some new machinery would fall into this category. The third category is government spending, which covers everything that government spend money on, including salaries, infrastructure, equipment, weapons, and so on, anything government spends money on. The last term in the GDP equation is net export, which is the differences between the value of goods and services that have been exported from a country and the value of goods and services that are imported to the country. This makes sense because GDP is trying to measure the size of the economic country in our own country, or the size of the economic activity in our own country. We are interested in what people from other countries brought in our country, but we need to offset that by what we bought in other countries, since these things do not contribute to economic activity in our own country. All of these calculations are based on the final sales price of all goods and services. So in simple terms, the GDP of a country includes all the goods and services that are produced in that country and sold to somebody. It's pretty much as straightforward as that. Now, when you read the news or listen to politicians, the health of the economy is always a big topic. The million-dollar question is always how to move the country ahead and make it better for all Canadians, in the case of Canada. As you'll see from the clippings on this slide, this discussion is commonly framed around GDP, and there's a general belief that higher GDP means that we are better off as a country. With relation to GDP and being better off as a country, it means that we believe that there is a positive relationship between GDP and our national welfare. Now, since GDP seems to be the most trusted measure for economic performance, and also because GDP is the foundation for necessary and key policy decisions, there is a lot that hinges on the correctness of all of these assumptions. So let's look at GDP in a little bit more detail. What you see on this chart is how the Canadian gross domestic product, GDP, has evolved since about 1960s. You have years on the x-axis at the bottom and GDP in trillions, with a T, of dollars on the y-axis at the left. It's pretty obvious during this period that the Canadian GDP has grown dramatically. The growth has been close to a factor of 20, while at the same time, the Canadian population only grew by about a factor of 2, from about 18 million people to almost 38 million people. But despite the general upward trends, there are some significant bumps in the curve. The dip we see around 2008 there is associated with the global financial meltdown. The downturn in 2015 there is related to low global oil prices that negatively affected the Canadian economy, because the Canadian economy is heavily tied to these natural resource extractions. Now, the numbers stop in 2018, which means we haven't really seen the effects over the last couple of years with everything that's happened, and including another drop in oil prices. I want to explain two terms that are commonly used when we're discussing the health of an economy. And those two terms are recession and depression. A recession is a temporary decline in economic activity, which is called when the GDP falls in 2 consecutive quarters. So when the GDP falls for 2 consecutive quarters, and so a quarter is a 3-month period, so when we have essentially 6 months in a row, so 2 quarters of economic decline, then we call that a recession. A depression is a longer downturn of the economy. Economists generally only talk about a depression if the fall in the GDP lasts for 2 years or longer. But the GDP has a few interesting prosperities that are somewhat at odds with its use as a measure of national welfare. So let's take a look at this in a bit more detail. In August 2005, Hurricane Katrina, a Category 5 hurricane, slammed into New Orleans and surrounding areas, and it completely devastated this whole area. By the end, there were over 1,800 deaths attributed to the storm, and roughly 850,000 houses were destroyed. A tremendous number of jobs were disrupted. It was just bad, and all the flooding and all the personal injury and suffering, and the statistics go on and on and on. It was a bad deal. In total, the damages that Hurricane Katrina caused were estimated to be about $125 billion with a B dollars, which made it the costliest tropical cyclone on record, and it is tied with 2017's Hurricane Harvey. So these are big, devastating events. So you would think that an event that produces so much destruction and disruption and suffering would have a significant negative effect on the GDP of the United States. But the US GDP actually went up during that quarter. It even went up faster than expected, as you can see in the quote from this news story. Now, how is that possible? Well, it turns out that the recovery efforts in response to national disasters and natural disasters are all included in the GDP. This means that bigger and more severe natural disasters are better for the GDP, because these natural disasters all require more recovery efforts. Now, while it's correct that disaster recovery is critical work, it's necessary to realize that this does not increase welfare. It simply restores social welfare to where it was before. Similarly, pollution cleanup contributes to GDP. Here it is even more extreme, as both the extraction of the natural resource, in this case oil, and the cleanup of the spill both contribute to GDP. And again, these efforts are restoring welfare, these cleanup efforts, not creating new welfare. Anything we buy to prevent crime, like security services, locks, or surveillance equipment, also contribute to GDP, and so do any war expenses. So the more the society spends on military equipment and services, the better their GDP looks. Similar to disaster cleanup, this is not creating new social welfare, but rather protecting existing social welfare. So it seems odd that everything else being the same, a society that needs more crime prevention and more military services would be considered better off. Last example are medical expenses. So medical expenses associated with fighting disease also contribute to GDP, which again doesn't really seem to make sense. The medical system is not about creating new welfare, but rather reestablishing the welfare of the sick. It kind of seems wrong that medical expenses should be a positive contributor to the national measure of welfare. So these are some of the challenges of the GDP. There are also many activities that contribute substantially to the quality of our daily lives, but they're not included in the gross domestic product. Basically, anything that we don't directly pay for, or at least not officially, is not included. So this includes things like housework, or the raising of children, or any volunteer or unpaid work. Now, even if there is some money exchange, it only counts if it goes through official channels. So if you buy something from someone on an internet site like Craigslist, for example, that doesn't count towards the GDP. And finally, the people getting value from public goods are also not included in the GDP. So, for example, the calm and relaxation that you get from strolling through the park or going on a hike, that contributes substantially to your well-being and welfare, but it's not a part of the calculation of social well-being, social welfare, and in this case, the GDP. It's not calculated into the GDP. Another key point to be aware of is the fact that the GDP does not take externalities or the depletion of exhaustible resources into account. In other words, we don't consider the negative environmental effects of our economic activities, and we're only concerned about the now and not the future. So economic activities that make the most sense and most use out of our resources right now, regardless of any environmental or long-term consequences, those are the activities that calculate best for the GDP. Let's summarize what we talked about in this lecture about GDP. The gross domestic product, GDP, only includes monetized exchanges of goods and services that have gone through official cash registries, and it ignores all of the non-monetized and non-market economic activities. The GDP also does not distinguish between welfare enhancing and welfare detracting costs. Furthermore, it does not take environmental degradation into account, and the calculation of the GDP does not care whether the consumption that is included in the calculations is sustainable or whether that activity is not sustainable. If we apply the concepts of the GDP to our personal lives, our well-being would be defined simply by how much money we spend, regardless of how much money we make, how much debt we have, or how healthy we are, or what else is going on in our lives. Now, this simply doesn't seem like a meaningful representation of our overall personal welfare. So there are big question marks about this positive relationship between GDP and human welfare. And even though the GDP has become the world's most ubiquitous indicator of economic health and well-being, it was never actually intended to be used like this. Here's a quote from Simon Kuznets, who invented the GDP. And quote, "The welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measure of national income." As we discussed earlier in this lecture, the GDP was created during a time when unemployment was a massive issue, and growing the economy was central for getting these people jobs. However, there is much more to national welfare than just spending. Now, most economists would agree with the weaknesses of the GDP that we've talked about here, but it's still used very widely as the primary indicator for making decisions about economic policies. Before you listen to the next series of lectures on this topic, I challenge you to a little thought experiment. So imagine you are a top economic advisor to the Canadian Prime Minister, and he or she asks you to create a new measure of national welfare and prosperity for Canada. So given what we talked about with respect to the pros and cons of the GDP, what would you put in to your new indicator for wealth and prosperity?